Today, I'm really excited because I have a friend who is also a top expert in the field of brain injury in children and work in schools. And I will introduce you to her. I was trying to think, we met in 2013 because I was invited to present at a conference in DC. I thought I was representing Connecticut, and it turns out I was representing the United States.
Winery and vineyards.
We can hear you guys.
Really? Oh, sorry.
I thought I was representing the state of Connecticut. And when I went down there, I realized I was representing youth sports parents across the whole nation. And to represent the schools across the nation was this wonderful woman named Brenda. And I actually, I had gotten a breast cancer diagnosis, and I put them off 3 weeks to take the tumor out because I really wanted to go to this event. So it was really super special. And Brenda and I met each other and instantly have connected, and she's come up to Connecticut and done trainings. And so here, my friend Brenda. Hi, Brenda.
Hi, everybody. So happy to see, I see some friendly faces I know here, and it's nice.
So Brenda, why don't you tell us, because I don't know if everybody knows, you are a star on the national stage of this brain injury and schools, return to learn, brain step, the whole thing. People know you for that. But I would like to ask, what is a child or what experience growing up brought you to work in brain injury?
Well, I actually, it was a personal experience. So when I was 14 years old, I live in Pennsylvania still. And when I was 14 years old, my brother, who was a year younger than me, it was summertime. He was riding his bicycle. This was, 30 some years ago. And he did not have a helmet on. There was no helmet law back then. And a woman who was on her way home from work, hit him and, threw him in the air, and he landed on both feet, breaking multiple bones in both feet, both knees, compound fracture of his femur. He had a grand mal seizure at the scene. I was at the scene, and my parents were at the scene. So we all ended up at the scene because we lived in the rural Pennsylvania, and, it took a while for the ambulance to get there. And long story short, he landed on both feet, but he flew back and cracked his head and sustained a severe traumatic brain injury from that. So he missed a year of school while he was in rehabilitation. And during that time, he had a tutor from school, but when he came back to school after missing a year, he looked normal and he acted normal to everyone at school, but learning was so difficult for him. And so watching that, I thought, this is so hard on my brother. It's so hard on my parents. And as a sibling, it was hard for me. And so I thought I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to school to be a special education teacher. And while I was sitting in my course at Wittenberg University in Special Education 101, I remember looking at our chapter we had to read, and it said that traumatic brain injury was just added to the special education law, IDEA. So this was back in like 1990. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is why he couldn't think all those years. He couldn't remember. He couldn't function in school the way he had. No one had ever explained that. The focus was always on his broken bones, his leg he almost lost. And so from that point on, I thought, you know what, I need to do something. I need to get involved and help other families and other children. And the stars aligned, and through several different stars that aligned, I was able to end up, I got my master's degree in the educational aspect of brain injuries at George Washington University. That program is still running if anyone's interested. And then I moved back to Pennsylvania. I was outside of Washington, D.C. teaching in Fairfax, Virginia for a few years. And I came back to Pennsylvania. I had twins. And then in 2007, the Brain Steps program was created by our Department of Health. It's a brain injury school consulting program for children and adolescents who attend any school in Pennsylvania.
And how many schools would that be?
So we have 500 public schools. We have thousands of cyber, charter, private schools. And we have 30 Brain Steps teams. It's funded by our Department of Health and our Department of Education. And it's implemented through our educational intermediate units and overseen by the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania. So it's a unique braided joint effort. And we have about 275 brain injury educational consultants, and that's who I work with on a daily basis to when students are referred to the Brain Steps program, we then, try to connect the medical, the rehab, the educational pieces, and help the school create an educational plan. And then we follow those children until they graduate from high school.
One of the really unique things that I think that you came up with in that program is the tool, that there needed to be 2 people in every school, that it just wasn't a one-person job, that 2 people would work together and fill out assessment forms on each kid. And I haven't seen that replicated in other places.
So yes, so if you think about the Brain Steps program, I said we have 30 teams, and we do, and our 30 teams cover Pennsylvania. However, when our youth sports concussion law for students went into effect in July of 2012, Brain Steps had been here since 2007, and we've been accepting all severities of acquired brain injury. Well, what happened was we had so many physicians that were making referrals and schools for students who were getting identified as having sustained a concussion now. They were automatically referring them to Brain Steps. Well, our Brain Steps teams were overrun that first year by concussions. And we all know that, concussions tend to resolve pretty quickly. However, there's about, 20 to 30% of students who don't recover in about 4 to 6 weeks, who go on to experience lingering symptoms. So our Department of Education had a meeting with Brain Steps and asked that we create a model for the state to train any school district. So our Brain Steps teams are at the intermediate unit here. The school districts are under the intermediate units.
And where would the 504 be? Do you actually need a 504 to get past the Brain Steps, or is that just within the school, within the school hierarchy?
It's within the school's hierarchy. And if they decide with our support, we can help them look at determining factors for whether or not a student might need special education or might need a 504 plan. We can help them with those decisions, but it's definitely a school team decision in the end. And so that's where Brain Steps then interfaces with the concussion management team at the school for Return to Learn. And we've trained over 3,000 Return to Learn concussion teams since 2013 in Pennsylvania. And Colorado adopted the Brain Steps model, built all the pieces of it in 2016. And Janet's on today and with us today. And she is one of the co-directors in Colorado.
I remember, I think that it was under 400. I remember the jump to 800. I mean, it's just amazing. This really has been your baby.
I love that piece, the concussion management, and I love it because it made the Brain Steps team members' lives easier, because we now are only getting referrals for students who have not recovered in 4 to 6 weeks. So for those students, we have the schools manage them for the first 4 to 6 weeks. Then they make a referral to Brain Steps, and it's really making a consistent process for our state, because schools are receiving these students anyway. They're getting identified because we have a sports concussion law. So sometimes we would hear, yeah, but we don't have that many. Or what if this just digs up concussions everywhere and then we have too many? You're getting these kids anyway. The school nurse is getting them anyway. The school counselors are getting them anyway. We provide a statewide protocol, process, training, and toolkit. So everyone is doing it consistently, because then that in the end saves staff time, staff effort, and it provides a student with consistency in care.
Yeah, it really does depend in my area what school you're in, with what what resources, and there's no consistency from school to school. Also, I think that the way that you set it up, that really empowered the schools to have a 2-person team. And I've seen a 1-person team, and then there was an idea that you had to have 6 people together. I know with my son's concussions, it took 3 weeks to get 6 people together to have that first meeting.
Yeah, we really give everyone everything they need to put a team together, and we train them through a 5.5-hour online training. However, we require a couple things. First, they have to have an academic monitor identified and a symptom monitor. So those are the 2 people that Catherine keeps talking about. They have to have 2 people, because if you only have one, it usually ends up being the school nurse, and then she gets overwhelmed. You have to have 2 people monitoring. And then we let them add up to 8 people per team. So some of our teams actually have 10 people on it, and they can set up however many teams they want in their buildings, in their school district. Some might have 1 per district, some might have 1 per building. So it really varies. But yeah, the recommendation is definitely to have a monitor at the school, but we have found that an academic monitor to monitor when a student with a concussion returns to academic baseline needs to be paired with a symptom monitor who's just kind of keeping track of the student. Are they having symptoms? But there's a fine line, because you don't want to constantly be asking the student a checklist of symptoms, because then it's almost like you are being suggestive,
Yeah.
So you just
I have heard that people are backing off doing like symptom, like headache logs, that if you're every 15 minutes you're logging if you're having a headache, it can really just sort of add to the psychological carry there.
Yes, and the psychological piece is something we really look at. We look at the mental health piece, because if a student who gets referred to us at 4 to 6 weeks after a concussion, they haven't recovered typically. So we know that they should be screened by somebody for anxiety, depression, because that is a huge, huge piece of the puzzle for a lot of these students. They need that mental health support, especially during COVID, in the pandemic, and one could benefit from some mental health support.
And how has COVID changed how, so in this last year of COVID, how has that changed your program?
Well, it's interesting. I actually looked at the data from the year before COVID and then this year, each month, to look at our referral rates. And I thought they would be lower. However, we have been getting 60% of the referrals that we had before. So I'm glad to see that that hasn't gone down. However, we are not getting as many concussions. And we know there's lots of reasons for that. Sports weren't being played, students were at home, people weren't taking vacations, lots of different reasons. But that is the biggest thing that we saw was we were still getting referrals. However, it was about 60% of the referrals.
Were those moderate to severe TBI, or was there a group of concussions that were less, like you saw fewer mild TBI?
Consistently, our program receives 75% of our referrals are concussions that have not resolved in 4 to 6 weeks.
Wow.
So that about 20% of our referrals are moderate severe brain injury, and then 10% are non-traumatic brain injuries. And that's remained pretty consistent since we began. Concussions definitely are the majority of what Brain Steps does. Concussion management.
You've been such a visionary in bringing this program. And again, I always refer to it as your baby, because you have, you've grown with it. You went and got your PhD as part of it. You and it are very intermeshed. Where do you see it going in the future? Like what, if you weren't tied to budgets, or if, in your, what's needed next in your creativity and foresight in this field? What's the next thing?
Well, first, let me say that I feel really, really lucky that when I started the Brain Steps program in conjunction with all of our funders and the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania, when this program started, the first thing I did was got on a plane and went to Oregon and Dr. Janet Tyler's program in Kansas because they had TBI school reentry teams. So I took pieces of what they did and brought it back to Pennsylvania and then rolled out a version of the TBI team model. We did open it up to all acquired brain injuries as long as the brain injury occurred at some point after birth. And so now Janet and I are working together doing brain steps because she's in Colorado and I'm doing it in Pennsylvania. We are in 2 states right now. We get calls about every month. Either Janet or I will have someone that reaches out from a different state that is interested in starting something like this. We would love if people did. It would be great. It's needed. I cannot tell you the parent calls we get from other states, the state people who call us from other states. But, you know, people are always concerned about funding. Now, so that's always an issue, but Brain Steps is not an expensive program to run if you fit it into your educational infrastructure. Don't create something new and try to fit a structure into what's already in your state. You want to find out, how does your Department of Education already train school staff and kind of fit into that? But, you know, offer training on brain injury. It doesn't have to be the Brain Steps model. It can be offer training on brain injury to educators. Try to find people who are passionate about it, who can really, you know, lead an effort in a state, because really that's what it takes. Just someone who can get the Department of Education support, get your Health and Human Services or Department of Health support. And, but you definitely, we see a benefit to having both state departments of education involved. I mean, Department of Education and Department of Health, because it's a medical issue, right? Brain injury is a medical occurrence that leads to educational impacts over time. And it's not just a once and done. You know, you can't go in and do a training for school staff when a student's coming back to school after a brain injury and assume that, okay, things are good now, because the brain is developing over time until the mid to late 20s. So what that means is well, here, I actually have a slide I pulled up. I'm going to show you.
I allowed Brenda to have a slide because this is the slide. And if you've watched this, our show before, this is a slide that I've tried to recreate with my hands several times.
Yes. So this isn't the slide she's talking about, but it's next. Okay. This is a slide from the National Institute of Health, doctors Lenroot and Geed. And it's the brain scans of a brain from age 5 to 21, I believe. And the blue areas show brain maturation over time. Okay. So that is that slide. First of all, it's very pretty, but other than that, it's very indicative of, you know, when you're younger, you don't have really memories that you can easily recall from age 1 or age 2. You know, your memories start to solidify around age 3, they think. Now, if you have a brain injury as a child, this is an important slide. It's from it's from Harvard, the Center for the Developing Child. There are sensitive periods of development, as you can see here, when children are going through rapid brain maturation in the areas that are shown on here, like, for instance, language. The preschool years have a lot going on. So if you have a child who sustains a moderate, severe traumatic brain injury during the preschool years, whatever was not developed at the time of the injury is more vulnerable to interruption in that child's development, their cognitive development, their behavioral development. And also, and we always, those of us in the field of brain injury in pediatrics, always talk about the frontal lobes, because the frontal lobes of your brain, you know, are the biggest lobe. It's in the front of your skull. And it tends to be the lobe that is injured most often, especially in younger children, because they fall a lot and all sorts of reasons. But the frontal lobes of your brain go through maturation periods until the mid-20s. So what is in your frontal lobes? Well, your frontal lobes are responsible for your attention, your speed of processing, how you take things in and make sense of it, for memory, and your executive functions are housed there. So your higher order thinking skills, your ability to make sense, to draw on your background knowledge, to apply it to knowledge in the future that you're reading about, maybe in school, or it's all of your executive functions. And if your frontal lobe is injured during preschool, this is an example.
Well, we could
Your
take
frontal
me.
lobes-
At 2, I did a header into a radiator and split my forehead open and was in the hospital. So at
How
2,
old
there's
were
a
you?
lot going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And so if you have a brain injury of your frontal lobes when you're younger, it makes sense that the full effects of that injury may not manifest until you need your higher order thinking skills. So middle school, when you start to have to be more independent, you have to keep an assignment notebook, you have to let your parents know what's going on at school. This is when we see, not all kids, but a lot of students after a brain injury really start to need additional supports. And let me go to, whoops. Okay, one more. So this is the slide that Catherine was talking about. And those of us
I'm sure everyone in the crowd is going, yes, I remember her doing this slide with her hands.
So this is just an example of, and there's lots of variations of this out there. Dr. Sandra Chapman from the University of Texas has a great series of 3 graphs where she talks about something called neurocognitive stall. And what some of us see sometimes in children, like I just talked about, and I use the executive function frontal lobes that might show up over time. Typical development is the blue line. It goes in an upward trajectory for the majority of children, for the average child. So you may have a student who's on this red trajectory, a little bit higher than the average blue line. Then a brain injury happens. The student may come back to school and seem like they're doing okay. We see that often because they're falling back on their prior knowledge that they knew before their brain injury. And that serves as like a cushion for a lot of students because they, they might not have been out of school for that long, maybe a few months. So their teachers may get a false impression that, hey, they're okay, they're fine. However, we need to stop and think, okay, if they've had a brain injury, how is their learning going to be in the future? We aren't as concerned about what they remember from the past because usually that tends to remain intact. Instead, it's how is the student going to be able to learn as school becomes more complex, as social relationships become more complex as they age. And sometimes what happens is you might not see that student reach the level they were at prior to their brain injury. And then over time, you may see the gap widen between the student and their same age peers. And so we experience this often. And this is why this slide, it's so imperative that if you know a child who sustained a brain injury, you should follow them until they graduate. And then even through, if they go to college, if they go to trade school, whatever it may be, through their mid-20s, see if any new issues come out, see if they have trouble learning. Neuropsychologists are great to test for cognitive processes that could have been injured. And we have to remember that children return to school after brain injury, whereas adults return to work. So we have to look at a student's job is to go to school. And so school is the best place really to do observations, real world, functional, how's this child doing in school? Because if you don't support them with appropriate cognitive, physical, mental health, whatever they may need supports, then, the research shows that they may have academic failure, they may drop out of school, they could have chronic behaviors, social isolation. And then there's even studies in the juvenile justice world showing how many students in the juvenile justice world have had prior multiple brain injuries. There's a lot of research being done in that area right now. and they also go on without supports. They could go on to have difficulty holding a job, having delinquent behaviors, and ending up in crime or drug abuse, or it's just, we have to support our children, because children with brain injuries become adults with brain injuries.
It seems from the work with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that there's really this connection that even something, divorce, child abuse, neglect in the childhood age, I don't see in the ACEs materials. They do talk about abuse, but brain injury. And I just feel that we're not there yet with understanding this trajectory. And also clinicians out there not asking about an entire childhood experience.
It's funny.
What are
you
your
mention
thoughts?
that. I do have thoughts on that. We brought in a speaker this year to talk about specifically ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and brain injury, acquired brain injury, because it does fall under an adverse childhood experience. It's traumatic, it affects the child, and without appropriate positive supports to mediate those negative effects from the adverse childhood experience, that child's going to have issues over time.
Do you think it should be added specifically as an experience? Because, I'm wondering about the sports concussion really doesn't fall under the categories as we have them.
So there is a gray area, and the gray area is that we have moderate severe injuries and we have concussions. And then we have the concussions that don't resolve, especially the concussions that are considered complicated concussions, where there's maybe a skull fracture involved, maybe there's a brain bleed, there's something on a scan that makes that concussion more complicated. Those concussions tend to take longer to recover from. We see anecdotally students who've been diagnosed with a concussion, but then have a brain bleed or something other finding, they tend to sometimes not recover. So there is a gray area between the concussion and the moderate traumatic brain injury.
In my son's case, he had had 10 concussions over a 6-year period, but it wasn't really till we did that assessment. We assessed him before he went off to college. My camera's being really weird. We assessed him before he went off to college. And it was at that assessment that she really did an entire assessment. And it turned out, as a preemie twin, he had a brain bleed. And her thought was that brain bleed at birth, which we all knew about, but since his first concussion wasn't until he was 12, we never thought that there might be some vulnerability there, that may have connected them all. So even though I was in the field and taking him to the top doctors, that continuum wasn't put together. So I think it's important as clinicians to really take very in-depth family histories and ask those questions about brain bleeds, strokes, neglect, sports injuries, hospitalizations, because I think it does form the larger picture.
Yeah. And the word that you said that really is important to focus on is, what vulnerability did they have prior to their injury? Because we know that those modifiers can modify outcome. Did the student have a prior learning disability? Did the student have prior depression, anxiety, after a concussion or any severity of brain injury? That student could become worse. Headaches, family history of migraines, do a good clinical history, pull in a social worker. They do great clinical histories and find out,
but as a mother social worker, I didn't put it together, and that's what I bring up this case is, here I am, I'm in the field, I'm doing research, and I never thought, it really wasn't until he was 18. They're like, well, you mentioned brain bleed. And it's true. We did know that his MRIs he had grown around that particular injury, but that's the piece of putting those all together. So, and neuropsychs are expensive. I mean, we on average paid $4,000 or $5,000 for them, pieces of insurance. That's where, having access to these assessments are really important. And I think all the data then the school can add in from the brain steps of having 2 different people track these pieces then if you don't have the healing over time, you have the data, you're just not looking at a kid going, why aren't you better?
Yes. And, I told you earlier that we have 75% of all of our referrals are concussions that didn't resolve in 4 to 6 weeks. Some do resolve. However, once a student has been referred to Brain Steps, we follow up with their parent and their school annually to ask them a series of questions to check in about school, academics, cognitive, all of that. Then we also ask them, does this student need additional support from Brain Steps this year? And it's about 30% who do need continued ongoing support per the parent or the school. That's what we found over the past few years.
Well, that is a perfect stopping point because it's 2:31 and I knew I was going to want to talk to you for a long time. I do want to open it up. At this point, I changed the view. So I look at the gallery view and we can go on and talk, no problem. But if I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions, David, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I do.
Hi, David. Meet my friend Brenda.
How are
Meet
you?
David.
Hi, Brenda.
David.
I've used Brain Steps before, and I think it's an outstanding program. I think it should be mandated for every school district in every state in the country. And let me tell you some of why very quickly. I just finished 35 years in public education. Coach, administrator, athletic director, you name it, I was there. And being in the fabric of the school, I think some things that people need to understand that happen in schools is because you can't see concussions, there are groups of teachers in each school who don't believe they're real, who believe these kids are Academy Award winning actors and actresses, and the appropriate things are not done, including inappropriate things like doing things that cause more frustration and anxiety to these kids. And I think we have to realize, and Catherine said it in the beginning, from state to state, from town to town, a lot of this is just disjointed. It's all over the place. You may go to a school district that has a very, very good program. You may go to a school district that has no program. You may go to a school district that has a program when one of their former students who's playing in the NFL sustained a significant concussion. So I think it's important to have people like Brenda doing what they're doing in school systems because they can focus on these things while teachers are teaching. Teachers were not trained to be brain injury specialists. And I think because of some of this, that there are just so many things that are missed and not made available to kids as they're recovering, to kids and families, very significant for families. And I think people has to realize that goes on out there. And the thought among some teachers and even teachers that are athletic people, here's yet again an athlete who athletes already get more than everyone else because they're athletes. Here they are looking for yet again more. And not enough credence is given to what is going on, especially with something you can't see. So that's very frustrating. It's always bothered me for a long time. And I think it's got to be pushed more. And I think Brenda has the perfect program to be able to do these things in a sequential order. Even with a program like Brenda's coming in, it doesn't turn around overnight. But when people start to continue to see people that are trained and they're consistent, all of a sudden they start to say, gee, you know what? I think the pieces fit there. And they're apt to come on board and do what's right and appropriate for kids and families. So that's just my.
Well, that was wonderful. And I do have to say, thank you for those compliments. And so everyone knows, David Johnson and I are not related, although it may sound like we were because his compliments were so nice.
I didn't even think about that as I was talking. I really didn't.
But David was there when Brenda came up on 2014. I used my kids, I had money put away for the kids for college, and I used that money to run 2 state conferences, brought Brenda and some other experts in, and we trained 600 school nurses. At the time, we were waiting for our concussion law to change. And I thought, well, it's either going to change and we're going to have to do a conference, or it's not going to change and we'll have to do a conference. So Brenda came on up and we did a conference. I think the teacher, the nurses really appreciated the training, and I've gone into local schools and updated them. But in the end, the state's like, we want to build something from within. We want, and it's frustrating. It's really frustrating to get to the state level and to pitch an idea that's so good and then get the pushback. Well, we want to develop our own thing. And so I'm just here to tell you, take Brenda's thing and develop it for yourself.
And the
But
nurses
don't
are
start to
begging-
reinvent the wheel.
No, and you don't have to. Or if you start to reinvent the wheel, you're changing things to things that are not correct or appropriate. It's all right there, and the nurses are begging for it. Nurses where I have been have said, we weren't trained in this. We weren't trained in depth. And when I say in depth, it doesn't have to be. It just has to be with the basics. And they become very frustrated because they're the first one to get these children walking through their door during the school day, sometimes with a small room with 15, 20, who knows how many kids that are there. And not all from school sports and athletics, skateboarding, other things that happen. And the nurses get very frustrated. They just want to be updated in the basics.
Yeah. I agree.
I have a question.
Yes.
My name's Diane Shermer and I'm in Kentucky. And you take me back to my early days in brain injury. I trained in the Houston Medical Center. I was at TIER. And I actually, years ago, when you were doing your education, I wrote the state guidelines manual for school reentry for brain injury there, and did a lot of work in pediatrics. So I'm thrilled to hear what you're doing. I work in a state right now, and I'm the chair of the brain injuries chapter here in a state that I consider is way behind the 8 ball in brain injury rehabilitation. And we're trying to get things where they should be for adults, but I have someone who constantly begs me to get things going for kids. And so I'm thrilled to know what you're doing. My first question is, what about the kids that aren't coming through for concussion, that come out of the hospital after being in an automobile crash? Do you pick them up as well?
We do. So on our 30 higher level brain steps consulting teams, we partner with the children's hospitals across the state, with trauma units. We have rehabilitation therapists from community organizations serving on our educational brain steps teams with our core educational team members. And so part of that responsibility is when they identify a child at their Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, for example, then they make referrals to the Brain Steps program. It's an online, anyone can make a referral, and we secure the appropriate permissions. But yeah, medical rehab is extremely important. We still are not getting all of the students that are having brain injuries, or we get them years later when they're failing, and we don't want to wait. We want them, if that student's had a brain injury, refer them to Brain Steps, because we can start supporting them now rather than when it's almost too late for the student to recover their ability to get back on track as much as they can. So one thing though that has always been a struggle are the students with more moderate traumatic brain injuries, because they tend to not always go to rehab, or they go to outpatient rehab and they get lost. We get them often, but not until they start failing courses and start having mental health issues. But I really wish there was something we could do to get them sooner. It's just something we've
Well,
always
in many states,
trying.
because there have been so many changes in rehab, many states have waivers, and many states waivers don't cover peds, unfortunately. And so my other question would be, to get something like this going in the state, you start with the Department of Education and the Department of Health?
And I would also add in your brain injury association or brain
I
injury
am that.
alliance. Good.
I
So
am
that's,
that.
yes. So like in my world, those are the three pieces I would want. And I would also want to know, what is your state's data in their Department of Education? Like, how many students have they already identified? Can you
Yeah.
show that, look, brain injury is a leading cause of disability according to the Centers for Disease Control, but educationally we only have this many, so not that every student needs special education, because after a brain injury, that's not the case.
Mhm.
But just showing them what you already have in your state, and then looking at your Title V maternal child health block grant funding. That is what our Department of Health used to start the Brain Steps program.
Could
And
you say that again?
Yes, it's Title V maternal child health block grant funding. So find out who in your state holds that and see if you can fit brain injury into that. A lot of times they'll do programs for like sickle cell, anemia, and mothers who are pregnant. There's different programs. So that's where we fit.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
Brenda, what's the best way for people if they're interested? Because I know your offerings change over the years. What's the best way to get more of you? What are your
contact.
offerings at the moment?
I can send everyone my email address. Can I put it in the chat?
Yeah, no,
That's
but
what I asked.
what websites do you have up right now?
Well, if you need my contact information, you could always go to our website, brainsteps.net, N-E-T. I also have a website for just concussion that I co-own with Dr. Karen McAvoy. And that is a little longer. And the name is www.getschooledonconcussions.com. I'll put it in the chat box.
And they're really wonderful resources.
Yeah, it's free resources that you could download for schools or parents.
One of the questions in the chat is, how is Brain Steps different from Brain Stars? Never heard of Brain Stars.
Brain Stars is a manual that was created by Dr. Jeannie Dice Lewis in Denver, Colorado. And it is a great manual. I actually have it somewhere here. I don't know where, but it's here. I have a bunch of them. It is a great manual that you could give to schools. It's like a huge manual that has tabs for neurocognitive issues a child may be experiencing and strategies to try. So this is often helpful if, a school staff member is struggling with a student and they aren't getting a lot of support. This manual would be helpful. So Brain Stars is more of a manual that has different components of information, tracking forms, if I recall. We give it to all of our Brain Steps team members when they come in as new team members. But Brain Steps is an actual team-based model. So we actually go into the schools and do consultation and training on brain injury. It's confusing.
Yeah, that's the great explanation. Oh, there's a Brain Stars. Natalie is holding up the Brain Stars.
Yes, she's my team member. There she is, Natalie Smith. That's what Brain Stars looks like. She's a Brain Steps team member. Thank you.
Wow,
Natalie.
that is tabbed. It's a lot of tabs.
You can order that through Children's Hospital of Colorado, I believe.
And that's a Karen McAvoy?
No, that is Dr. Jeannie Dice Lewis. She has since
Okay.
passed away, but Children's Hospital of Colorado. If you email me, I'll send you the person that I order them from, if anyone needs them.
That's awesome. Any other questions for Brenda? Zoe, did you want to? We can't hear you, Zoe. We would like to, though. You are
Catherine.
unmuted. Maybe your volume.
Catherine, can you hear me?
Hi, Marilyn.
Mhm.
Hi, this is a wonderful program. Thank you, Brenda. You're doing a fabulous job.
Thank you.
I want to make a suggestion, and particularly for the wonderful woman who's frustrated from Kentucky. Can you hear me, Catherine?
Yeah, no, we can sound great. Marilyn Spivak is speaking right now, for those of you that are listening on the phone.
So my question is, no one has mentioned, and Brenda didn't mention either, with all the wonderful resources and going through the frustration of the Kentucky Brain Injury Association. Nobody's mentioned members of the legislature. And my suggestion would be getting to the agencies with an issue that they don't want to hear about necessarily. And they put up a lot of barriers. Whatever agency you're going to is going to a member of your legislature, a head of the agency that would be dealing with health and education, and bringing this problem to a member of your Senate or your House of Representatives and laying out the issues. They will quickly open up the doors for you for that agency and become an advocate.
And Marilyn, hi, this is Diane Shermer, and I used to be Diane Gutierrez, and we met a long time ago, and thank you for that. And we are good friends with many people in the legislature, and actually Health and Human Services is working closely with us to get many things through, with assistance in getting the waivers changed, etc. So we have a lot of good support from very different legislative advocates
Good.
here. It's it's a good old boy mentality here. I hope I'm not offending anyone. It's just it's a land of opportunity and a lot of room for growth. So it's an opportunity here.
Well, I wish you well. And if I can be of any assistance, let me know.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And there'll be more of Marilyn next week because she's the guest on my show. So we will have Marilyn Spivak and Ron Savage for a whole hour. So I'm so excited, Marilyn, to go through the history with you, and looking forward to that show with you next week.
Well, Brenda, I just want to tell you, listening to you and being at the neighbors meeting, I think it was neighbors last year or the year before, with the focus on pediatrics and education. It's just amazing what you've all accomplished. And I am just so thrilled to see what you're doing. And yet the pages are just beginning to be turned. Because when you think of all the school districts, working with the schools is an extraordinary challenge, because I don't know, I think it's this way throughout the whole country, is that you have every city and town has a different school district. So it's really important to start at the top and filter down. And I don't know, I'm embarrassed that I don't have the answer to this anymore, but I don't know, Brenda, if you and folks from Colorado have worked with the regional training centers. They used to be special ed regional training colleges. There were 12 centers throughout the country. Do you know if they still exist?
No, I do not know. Janet's on here. I don't know if Janet knows. I am not familiar with that, Marilyn.
Well, with the Department of Education, please ask that question.
Okay.
Because they were the training source for special educators.
Got it.
Okay, and they sort of fell under the same regional area, the 12 regional areas for rehabilitation services administration. And you know, under OSERS, special education was a key part of that's OSERS establishment.
Okay.
So, but there were 12 of them. And
Okay.
we work with the one in New England.
Okay. I'm going to find out. Thank you for that, Marilyn. And I do have to say that I know Catherine keeps saying Brenda's program, but it's not. It is a joint effort. As I said, we have 275 brain injury consultants. 2 state departments fund it, the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania. So it is definitely not work that I do alone by any means. It's a huge statewide effort.
Well, you just said that. Every state that is strong, and Pennsylvania is one of them, Colorado is another. They already, the doors open for them because they're a known entity and respected, and they're the go-to agency, the go-to organization for brain injury. And you've worked very hard to establish that. So it's a tremendous amount of effort.
Yeah, it is. We were really excited because this past year, the CDC chose, well, there are researchers at Case Western Reserve University and Ohio State University who were awarded a study through the Centers for Disease Control, 4 years, $2 million to study BrainStep student outcomes compared to students in Ohio with TBI who do not have BrainSteps. So we are really interested to see at the end of that 4 years, do we make a difference? Anecdotally, yes, I think we do. I know we do, but we're going to actually have some data. So that will be nice. And Kara, and you had asked about male, female, if we had any data on that. We really don't. I mean, again, just running our numbers, we have about half and half. It's almost 50-50, our referral rates overall. But, we might get some better data analysis once the CDC study's done. Now, COVID has impacted this, a little bit, put it off a little bit, but we are in active recruitment right now. So that's an exciting thing. Look for that in the years to come.
I had another question. I also see somebody.
Actually, hold on a second. Carla, Zoe's been waiting. Let me just ask that Zoe, is your mic working now, Zoe? And then we'll go to Cara. No, it doesn't seem to. All right, if you want to type, Zoe, if you want to type your question in the chat.
She did.
Oh, do you want to read it, Cara?
Sure. Zoe's question was, have you linked childhood abuse trauma affecting the brain in similar ways as a concussion?
Good question. We talk about this a lot amongst ourselves because we do have students that get referred to us because of abusive head trauma when they were younger. And now usually they're with adoptive parents and they make a referral to BrainSteps. Those students often have moderate to severe injuries functionally. However, we often talk about how many children were shaken but did not go to the emergency room and are now in the schools mislabeled as an emotional disorder or as a, needing learning disability, extra support, and not properly identified as having a brain injury. And some people might say, yeah, but if they're still getting school supports, what's the big deal? Well, there is a big deal because brain injury is very different from other disability categories. Like Eric asked in the questions, are there any resources or approaches to working with students who have behavior issues after brain injury? And that is an area that's very different. You don't want to take a student who has a brain injury with a lot of impulsivity issues, explosive issues, and put them in an emotional support classroom, because that the way that an emotional support classroom is run is based on punishment, often, not all places, but after a brain injury, we know that we have to look at the antecedents of a student's behavior. We have to look at the environment. We have to talk with the teachers. What can they change about the interaction? Can they prepare a child? Maybe, we have them track and a student is exploding and melting down every day whenever she says, put your reading book away. We're transitioning to math now. Student may have meltdowns, explosions, flip desks. Well, if they track that over time and we can identify, okay, so let's look at what's happening right before these explosions that the student's having. Can we change the way that the student is prepared? Give the student more in advance time to make a choice. okay, do you want to get your math book out right now? 5 minutes before the rest of the class, we can tell the student, do you want to get your math book out right now? Or do you want to wait and do it in 5 minutes when we have the rest of the class get it out? You know, so little things that you can do to change and modify the environment. And sometimes that's hard because sometimes adults don't want to change. But after a brain injury, we have to watch our interactions with children and facilitate, because if they have impulsivity issues, it may not be controllable like it was before their brain injury. So we have to plan for that. Yes, Emerald, we have to give them a sense of control and a sense of structure. We have to make them feel like I'm so glad you brought that up. We have to give them, the students, the children after a brain injury, feel like they are in control. Scheduling, keep them on a consistent schedule. That's a big one too. Big one.
I was wondering, do you do, Dennis Goldenberg asked a similar question, if there's any booklet or tip sheet, I guess, for special ed educators, or whether it's like OTs or people in schools in other states besides where you are located.
So there are lots of great resources. If you go to the Brain Steps website, if you go to Kids with Brain Injury, I'll type that in here. Also, another website that I use all the time is by the New York, I believe, Brain Injury Association, it is the Mark Yelvasaker, Dr. Yelvasaker, his, what is it? Project LearnNet. It has fantastic little video vignettes of how to work with a student after a brain injury based on what the student's experiencing. Are they experiencing self-regulation issues? Are they experiencing meltdowns? Are they experiencing memory issues? Concrete strategies. Let me see if I can stick it.
Brenda, I can put that in there for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will. I see it.
Great
right
site.
now.
I think we have time for just one more question. If you see one in the chat, or, oh, Larry, yes, hi, Larry.
Yeah, Catherine, Brenda, Larry DePerac, Community College of Allegheny County, Pittsburgh.
Oh, all right. Close to me.
Yeah, so I've been in the business since 1984 and the head injury stuff. And I'm concerned about people who subsurface before they come to college. You know, they may present as a learning disability, they may present as having some other problems, but they don't have an adequate differential workup. And then when we get them at a college level, there are all those subsurface issues. You know, it's like the iceberg. And if you identify head injury, you can start digging into it, then maybe you get someplace. Otherwise, we lose them, okay? Because there are all those tangential issues from the head injury.
That's a huge, huge issue. Yes, because like we work with students here through the program that I direct until they graduate from college. Then, you know, we try to prepare them. We tell them to get in touch with the disability support services, get in touch with the vocational rehabilitation. We try to get them set up for success, but you're right. You know, so many fall through those cracks between high school graduation and college.
And part of the problem is that they no longer want to be special.
Yeah.
You know, want to be, yeah.
And one, you know, you bring up, you made me think of a good point. When a student is transitioning to a community college or a four-year college, if they are on an IEP for special education at school, their senior year, it may be beneficial to switch that to a 504 plan with the school. So because the 504 plan is something that the college, and I'm sure Larry can speak to this, can look at, and that can help prepare academic supports that the student may need at the college level. It can help inform them. It's just a little tip.
Right.
One more mini question. It's always hard to say goodbye.
I would like to make a comment.
Sure.
So this lost the screen. Anyway, I've got to get back to that. So sorry, let me just get the screen back on here. Sorry about
I'm
that.
sorry, I don't know who's speaking.
I think
This is Juliana Switte. Can you see my screen? I've got the
Yes.
name up.
Yep.
Oh, hello.
Hi. I wanted to comment about how to perhaps help differentiate between those people who are presenting with what might look like developmental delays or other issues from people who have had a prior head injury, whose conditions may be sort of persistent post-concussive syndrome, which may be manifesting as some of these other things. I couldn't recommend to you highly enough this book, but it's called Mild Traumatic Brain Injury, Episodic Symptoms and Treatment by Doctors Marianne and Richard Roberts. Marianne is a pediatric neuropsychologist, and Dr. Roberts is also a neuropsychologist. They've been working on this for at least 10 years, and they've developed a system of screening using what's called MIND. And that is multi-symptom intermittent neurobehavioral disorder. And in this book, they outline the symptoms and things to look for. And they wrote the book not only for clinicians, but also for primary care providers, but also for teachers, for social workers, for parents.
That's great.
That's awesome. We're actually at the end of, do you have a question for Brenda? Because we're just at the end of our time.
I wanted to bring this into, because I know that she was saying, if you could differentiate between those students, something like this could really help.
Great. Thank you. I've never seen that. So that's good to know. I love books. So thank you.
And Brenda did put her email in the chat. And a couple other resources that we'll pull together for the next session. And I so appreciate your time. We ran about 2 minutes over, but thank you for all the great questions. I'll give you, would you like to say goodbye, Brenda? And
yeah, everyone, I had a great time. I talk a lot, I'm sorry, but I'm passionate about this. So I appreciate every single one of you who are here, because it means that you're going to make a difference, hopefully in a child's life that who's had a brain injury. So thank you.
thank you, Brenda. And it's just been great. And there's so much that you've taught me and we've added into Connecticut where we could. And thanks for your comments, David. That was great to hear and share your 35 years of experience at all levels of school. And everybody take care, and we'll see you next week for Marilyn Spivak and Ron Savage on the history of brain injury. Take care, guys.